evening. My name is Bob Liff, and this is the CUNY Forum, a monthly town meeting that brings prominent New Yorkers together with faculty and students of the Edward T. Rogowsky Internship Program in Government and Public Affairs. When Bill de Blasio won the mayoralty, he did something we had not seen in this town for 12 years. He appointed an educator as chancellor of the city's sprawling school system. Carmen Farina, a veteran teacher, principal, and administrator, came out of retirement to head the Department of Education, overseeing 1,800 schools, more than 1 million students, and 130,000 employees, including almost 90,000 teachers. She's begun to make her mark, as evidenced by her recent removal of several dozen top district administrators. The new mayor and chancellor have steered away from the top-down, management-oriented oversight that was a hallmark of former Mayor Michael Bloomberg's stewardship. The school system is one of astonishing diversity and deplorable segregation. 4 in 10 students are Hispanic, more than 30% are black, Asian Americans are just over, and white students just under 15%. More than one in 6 face special challenges, including learning disabilities. Just over 13% are English language learners, meaning English is not their first language, and almost 4 in 5 qualify for free or reduced cost lunch, the school system's federally defined measure of poverty. The system also must educate students to succeed on standardized tests that now dominate its assessment and the assessment of teachers by public officials and the media. On the most recent standardized test for grades 3 through 8 in math, using the controversial Common Core standards we will be discussing in a bit, just under 19% of black students and just over 23% of Hispanic students scored at or above grade proficiency in English. Just over 18% of both black and Hispanic children scored at or above the level of proficiency defined by the test. Those disparate levels of achievement in the city and around the state have sparked renewed focus and public debates over the funding and management of public education, including charges that the city continues to be shortchanged in state legislative school aid funding formulas. The growing number of charter schools has also sparked charges that the privately run but publicly financed schools push traditional public schools from their longtime homes, discourage or transfer out special education students, and divert funds from the broader school system. All this is Mayor de Blasio, whose signature achievement thus far is winning at least short-term funding for universal pre-K, points to schools as the major engine for overcoming inequality. We're joined by 4 New Yorkers with different views about the current state of city schools and where we should be going in the future. Clara Hemphill, a former colleague of mine at New York Newsday, is the director of New York Affairs at the New School and author of many books on city schools. Kathy Nolan is an assemblywoman from Queens and chair of the Assembly's Education Committee. Basil Smikle is the president and founder of Smikle Associates and active in educational affairs, including those around charter schools in Harlem and beyond, and a graduate student at Columbia in politics and education, which makes it particularly apt. And Joe Vitariti, a former aide to a school's chancellor, is now a professor of public policy and urban education at Hunter College and CUNY's Graduate Center. Let me start with kind of the news off the top, Madam Chairwoman. Governor Cuomo, as we get near the election, I'm not sure if this is going to be run right before the election, recently described the school system as one of the last monopolies. Was that a helpful thing to say? I mean, he's been a proponent of shifting more and more to charter schools.
You know, Bob, I would just say this. I don't really want to get into criticizing the governor for just a few days before his election, but I don't share that view. I don't think that the New York City school system or any of the 700 school districts in the state are monopolies. I think they're a public good that we pay taxes for to educate our children and to have aspirations for. You know, I wasn't in the room when the governor said it. I don't know, you know, it was an editorial board meeting, so I don't know the context, and so I don't want to get into just taking a shot, but you know, certainly that doesn't reflect my view, and I don't think it reflects most of the people in the legislature's view, and I'm not even sure it reflects the governor's view. We do spend billions of dollars of our tax dollars on our public schools, and though I don't share a lot of the views that many of the views of the last few years that have come out, I try to at least feel that other people may have a different view, but they have the best intentions. Sometimes that doesn't come off in the education debates. People get very intense with each other right away, but you know, I certainly think education is an important public good, and no, I don't think it's a monopoly.
Clara, some of the most contentious debates have been around the Common Core. I mean, going back to no child left behind. You've seen this both on a national level and on a city level. It's an attempt to kind of impose standards by which you can measure schools, by which you can measure teachers. Kids are now taking Common Core tests, even though the curriculum was not geared to the Common Core. And I believe the governor has said he's not going to actually use the test results as a measurement tool. I mean, tell us a little bit about what the Common Core is and how this debate is developing.
Well, I want to make a distinction between the Common Core, which is a set of standards of what kids should be able to do in school, and the implementation, which I think has been completely botched. The Common Core standards really say, you know, kids in Mississippi should have the same level of education as kids in Massachusetts. We're not going to tell you how to teach. We're not even going to tell you what books you should read, but we think every child should be able to, for example, learn the multiplication table in 3rd grade or learn to multiply fractions in 5th grade. It's not the standards themselves which are so controversial, it's the way they've been rolled out and it's the way they've been implemented. In New York State, they had tests which I don't think really reflect what the standards are like. The tests in many respects are way too hard and very, very confusing. On top of that, they put in place the tests before they had any books to go along with them, before they had the textbooks. So the teachers were charged with preparing kids for tests that they'd never seen, with books that hadn't been written yet. And it was really a very, very difficult situation in New York, still is.
Joe, you've been a veteran of many, many civic debates. Going back, I think we first met in the Staten Island secession debate.
Yes, that is going way back.
And the debate over standardized tests, generally the Common Core more specifically, is the degree to which assessing public education is test-driven, that those numbers and those tests are a measure by which you should judge schools. It's very different than when I grew up, when there was a more, there was kind of a civic citizenship, kind of a softer, non-test focus. You've watched a lot of these debates. How do you assess this one?
Well, in favor of the Common Core, the Common Core is a great place to start with standards because it starts with identifying what students should know. And there was a time when we tested without that. The great benefit of the Common Core is an attempt to align some kind of a core curriculum standards with assessments, being the test. The problem is, as Clara said, and I would agree with her, is the implementation and the speed of the implementation. We were out there among the first in the country. So New York started these tests, but there was no preparation of the teachers. There were no materials ready. It was a very unfair way to do it, and it got particularly controversial when it was said that they were going to use these tests to evaluate teachers and eventually, assess them in terms of their performance and maybe tenure even. And so that's problematic because you don't yet have a valid instrument to do it. The idea, I think, is extraordinarily good, and it's a move in the right direction. But it's something that's going to take some time to implement in the right way, and they haven't had time to do that.
Basil, you've been very active in charter school affairs in Harlem and beyond. Is one of the raps on charter schools is that that they're very much into assessment. They're very much into measuring on the tests, almost to an unhealthy degree in terms of education. Is that a fair criticism?
I think it's unfair because I think it's not out of line with what's happening in other schools, in traditional public schools, and there's an important sort of distinction that should be made with respect to charter schools. I do believe that there is an academic and behavioral discipline in charter schools that some parents really like and some parents don't like as much. There are a lot of parents that I know that have taken their children out of charter schools because they don't have, they don't foster the sort of creativity and free thinking that maybe other schools, charter or traditional public schools, tend to excel in. So I think there are, the good thing about charter schools is I think there's enough variety in them that you have some schools that are much more rigorous in their sort of testing and sort of rote learning, and then there are others, especially some of the ones that teach language, that are a little more that foster a little more creativity and a little more camaraderie and collegiality in the classroom. And in New York, sometimes that's hard to see, because there are some individuals and some schools and some charter management organizations that dominate the conversation.
We're not going to mention
We're not.
Eva Moskowitz's name.
Well, no, we're not. But I think that, but there are a lot of smaller schools that get far less attention that are doing really great things and not as focused on the testing. I would also add that in other cities like Washington, D.C., where the charter schools comprise about 40% of the school population. In New Orleans, it's almost 80%, where I think there is a little more of a focus on that testing because it really does dominate the system.
A lot of this has come before the legislature as you try to, because as usual, New York City, we can't do our traffic lights, we can't, we can't set our speed limits. We can't do anything unless Albany tells us that it's okay.
I mean, to be fair, Bob, all cities in the state are creatures of the state.
Yes.
Part of the, all municipalities are created by state sovereignty, and then it goes from there, going
But
back
you
for
also
200
have-
years. So it's not like that just happened, and I know it's a frustration sometimes. I live in the city of New York too, so it's a frustration for me too. But I think that that Albany does have an important role to play. All the states do. I mean, that's the case in other states as well, whether it's Chicago or New Orleans or any other place. They have to work with their state government.
Let me ask you a question off of what Joe was saying, which is about this question of assessing teachers based on the test. The United Federation of Teachers has been extremely upset at the test focus. You could almost argue that if you judge a teacher by the results of the children on the test, that you're discouraging teachers from going into the most difficult schools.
Well, the city hasn't been covered under any of these assessments at this time because the city didn't come to an agreement, and there were all kinds of problems with that. We could have a whole show on that. So actually, that hasn't even really happened in the city of New York yet. And now that we pushed back some of these Common Core issues for 2 years, it's not anywhere on the horizon. So despite a lot of noise about it, it has not really happened. I want to just say about Common Core, and it may be because this is a public policy show. So, one of the things that happens in government is there are certain truisms. So when it comes, for example, to Common Core, I've actually become quite sour on it. I think there were a lot of people talking, as you both did, like, oh, we need those standards, we need to have some universal standards. And so we in the legislature then bought into that goal through Race to the Top from President Obama, which was really the lead push on that. But what we got was not so much the implementation, but the rise of big companies, whether it was Pearson or McGraw-Hill or some of the others, who then devised curriculum, even though they don't call it curriculum because we supposedly have local control of that, that was then sort of really pushed on people. And I think, and used, I've become very impressed with a woman named Carol Burris, who's a principal from Long Island, were really used to what she calls sort and select. And that's not what the legislature thought we were buying in a way when we supported the Race to the Top application from the Department of Education. And I don't think it's really what educators like you, Clara, or you, Joe, thought when you said, well, it'd be good to have standards, I think that the problem is, how do you get those standards? And I think what was offered has actually been something that's provided the Pineapple Gate, that silly thing, and other things that were certainly not what the legislature intended, and the governor and the legislature, we pushed back. And I could even envision a scenario when we push back again. I think that it's certainly been extremely controversial in many, many families in the state who are opting their children out of the testing because they do feel that there's been too many bubble tests and their child's not a bubble test. I think we're up to about 60,000 families, mostly upstate and in the suburbs, but I think that that movement may crest in the city as well. And so in the end, we're going to have to really look at what did we mean when we called for a Common Core? Like a lot of things in education, it sounded so wonderful, but was it not so much the implementation at state ed, but the inevitability that these big companies would come in and make a ton of money off of it and then use it to sort and select the kids, which is the last thing we want to see happen.
I respect your opinion, and there are enough people who agree with you that I may change my opinion. I've been saying for a long time, standards good, implementation bad. But a lot of people whom I respect say that you can't separate the standards from the tests. And I agree that the tests have been appalling. The hope was that we would close the gap between rich and poor. I've been to dozens of schools in the last year where the schools serving middle-class kids are adopting the Common Core just fine. They said, we've always done this. And the Common Core means you have a balance between literature and nonfiction. You speed up the math a little bit. You make sure children speak in class and write in class and don't just fill out standardized tests. In the good schools, that's been happening for a long time anyway, and they're not having a hard time adjusting to the Common Core. But in the schools that serve poor kids, the hardworking teachers are swamped. The kids are given books that are way, way, way too hard for them to read. For example, the textbooks which are recommended by the state recommend Charlotte's Web for 2nd grade. My kids read Charlotte's Web in 4th grade, and they were born in a family where English is spoken. So the notion that you can just give kids books that are way too hard for them to read and that that's going to somehow solve the problem, to me seems really short-sighted.
But it still begs the question, I think there has to be some kind of standard. And you don't want to have, I mean, standards to me are aspirations also. And you don't want to have different aspirations for poor kids and kids who are better off. And so what standards should do and attempt to do in setting at least what the teaching standards are is try to get everybody to a certain minimum point, which I think was the objective. They may have to go back and recalibrate the standards, the teaching standards or the curriculum standards. But I think it's very important if you're going to look at this from an egalitarian point of view, which is something I spend a lot of time writing about. You can't escape the idea of trying to get all kids to a certain point.
Right. And I would say too, you know, standards. The idea of standards or national standards has been around for a long time. I mean, back in 1983 with the Nation at Risk, they talked about, you know, our country should be thinking more about these issues because at that time we were thinking about economic competition from Japan and still in the Cold War. So what should we as a country be teaching our kids? So it's been around for, the idea of a national set of standards has been around for quite some time. But I think to all of your points, what I think Common Core lacks, or the implementation lacks, is a real understanding of the fact that the students are coming with such vastly different skill sets, and they're coming from such vastly different backgrounds that we're setting certain standards, but there's no way to standardize the background of the child when they get to school. And there's not enough being done around that, around getting kids to a specific point where they can meet this common core standard in a uniform way.
I do think Mayor de Blasio deserves a tremendous amount of credit, and I like to think the Assembly played a role in that. Speaker Silva, we've been talking about pre-K for a very long time. It's been a very big priority of the Assemblies, and a statewide priority, not just a city priority. And, you know, $700 million was a lot of money to put into pre-K, so I do think that's going to address some of the gaps in how people get exposed to words and various types of literature and things like that. But I can also tell you I've had a little bit of a sea change about the idea, not that we shouldn't have standards, or not that we shouldn't, obviously we want to address the achievement gap, but that maybe the best way to do that is to look again at local control in some ways. And I'm not advocating a return to the community school board model, but I think when I was in graduate school, one of the big things was that we had too many school districts. I mean, I can see the books in front of me that talked about 700 local school districts and that they should all be consolidated, statewide, and they should be consolidated. But the truth is, having local people grade tests, having local people be able to recommend things for their children, pick curriculum decisions, I think can ensure a certain level of almost individual, I think they like to use the word differentiated instruction, but it really just means not one size fits all. So I'm kind of changing my own views after many years in government and politics where that was just an accepted truism. You know, we have too many school districts, we should consolidate. The truth is, even when it comes to things like teacher education, we've now moved away from letting the ed schools grade their own students to some kind of a teacher bar exam, it's called, Ed TPA, which ends up costing student teachers a lot more money, is graded by some company. They get a national company. I think Pearson again got that contract too, where they pay people by the piece. You know, like a retired educator gets $50 for every video that they watch. And again, I can tell you in the legislature, when we heard Dr. Steiner, Hunter College's director of education, talk about videotaping teachers, it sounded like a wonderful thing, an opportunity for teachers to review their own practice. Again, that hasn't been what it's been. It's been sending that videotape to an out-of-state contractor who may or may not know what kind of class you're teaching, and it may focus more on discipline issues as opposed to creativity, or creativity versus standards, you know. So it's not what we thought it was, and maybe returning to a local control where the ed school grades the teacher would do a better job. And the same thing on Common Core. If teachers had more input into the curriculum, they could know then to address cultural sensitivity in the books that they pick. So this is just me as one individual, I'm not speaking for the committee or the assembly here. I'm just sharing my own evolution on these issues, Bob, that I think some of what we've tried just hasn't worked. And perhaps the intentions were good, but it's ended up making a lot of people a lot of money, and it hasn't really helped kids. And so we have to then step back and say, what's happening here, and look at it again.
Well, it's the commodification and the monetization of education.
Well, there's always been a lot of money in
part of it is-
education,
that's
though,
right.
Bob. You know, I can remember as
Right.
a high school activist going to 110 Livingston Street and realizing the
Which is
scope
now,
of the
which is now a co-op or a
yeah,
contract.
yeah, but realizing the scope of the contracts, you know, whether it's school food or school building. I mean, this is a $22 billion state allocation, and that's, you know, there's always going to be waste, fraud, and abuse. I mean, but I just think generally there might be a relook, at least on my part, at the idea of local control,
But isn't this-
local input.
I'd like to talk about
Yeah.
national financing, though.
Yeah.
I mean, it's one thing to have national standards. It's another thing to have local financing of
Well,
schools.
that's true. That's
so
true.
that what we have is Scarsdale is a very rich suburb. They can tax themselves at a very low rate and have really terrific schools. Whereas tiny little town upstate has to tax itself at a very high rate to get not very good schools. And this is the same problem in Mississippi and Massachusetts,
Right,
where
the use of the property tax, which is not a progressive tax. But, you know, the problem becomes, how do we take a system that's been in place for so many years? Are we going to end the property? Like, what are we going to do to replace that chunk of funds? And for a lot of the wealthier suburbs, the local tax is what makes them insist on local control. So I'm not trying to revert to that.
And
I
the
understand
taxes
what
are
you're
high
saying,
in
but
some of
it's-
those suburbs.
yes. But it is a challenge. I don't think anybody and we would look to the academic leaders to come up maybe
Well,
with
but
some
the
changes.
Supreme Court
How do we
has
come
made
up
it-
with a funding
the Supreme
stream
Court
other
has-
than the property
has
tax?
made it very clear
know?
that funding is a state issue. They will not get involved in it. And it's unfortunate because they talk it out of both sides of their mouth. I mean, I don't see how you can have equity and equality if you have a system that allows us literally to spend more on privileged kids and less on kids in need. I mean, that
Well, we
it's,
really
it's,
do. We
it's
do
a
and we
reverse
don't.
system.
We do and we don't. The state shares for those wealthier districts is very, very small. The amount of
But
state
what's
aid,
spent
some of
at the
my
local
Westchester,
level.
right? But the amount of money state money that some of our colleagues, I mean, it's a perennial issue in Albany that the students, the legislators from Westchester or from Long Island go crazy. They get a very tiny share of state money, and then their people are angry. They say we pay state taxes, we don't get it back in our schools. So they fund their schools almost entirely.
Yeah,
through
they
the
do it
local
on a
share.
local
And
level.
Whereas the city actually gets now, I just want to say, one of the things marital control did, because there was a memorandum of understanding that the city had to do a maintenance of effort, the city is now getting much more in state aid than it ever got in my time in the legislature, and has really gone a long way towards making up that gap, as well as having a maintenance of effort feature from the local government. But, you know, it's very complicated. I know that.
I would be remiss if I didn't channel the voice of my former professor, Mike Rebell, and former city council member Robert Jackson, who went to the state with the Campaign for Fiscal Equity and sued the state.
This is the lawsuit over funding.
Right, and sued the state and won. And they're a couple of $1 billion, I think, that the lawsuit said that the state owed the city because of the inequitable, the state, not just the city, right, in the inequitable funding stream, which apparently has not been distributed. Not that it's your issue,
no,
but
we made a start, and then 2008 happened. If the money's not there, you can't spend it.
Right,
So
right.
we're still not where we should be. There's no question about that, but that's still a goal
Right.
to be reached. And we did in this last go-round. It was the largest amount of money we've put in education in a very, very long time, well over $1.1 billion. And when you add in the pre-K, it really did bump the numbers back up.
And there are other states that are following suit with similar lawsuits because they're realizing that the funding formula just is not working.
This is also, this whole question of standards is coming at a time of, an ongoing shift of certainly the local economy, but the national and the world economy towards, away from manufacturing, towards an information-based economy, highlighting the need of STEM curriculum, science, technology, engineering, and math, which are probably the areas in which the disparities in educational achievement among rich kids, poor kids, different ethnic groups is very profound. That's one of the reasons I think the mayor's pre-K program is so important, because you got to get kids as young as possible and just start them on the path.
Right.
And but that kind of, ideally an educational system is to prepare kids for jobs and for living as adults in the economy that they're going to inherit. And so the standards argument, to me, is critical to the economic health of the city going forward.
Part of what happens, though, I have a thing that Plato said, something like, these kids today don't know as much. Employers are never going to be totally happy with the workforce, but the truth is young people today are coming out of school, they're brilliant, they know how to work the computer, they've been exposed. I know my own son in a New York City public school has been exposed to all kinds of literature, much broader than I did when I was in school, different genres, plays, poetry, journalism. Much more able to recognize different types of literature. So I always think there's a lot of good out there that maybe doesn't get the emphasis it should, because there is always going to be older people sort of resenting younger people's brilliance and sort of complaining about it at the same time. The other thing is everyone thinks their own child's school is great and that somebody else's school is not so great.
Everybody thinks that their own lawmaker is okay,
right,
but
that's
they
right.
think
The
that all the lawmakers
same
are
theory.
bums.
So I also want to say, I actually think of education, another thing for me, I'm evolving a little bit. It's great to say it's preparing the workforce, but it's really preparing people, like I say, a chance for happiness. Because if you're an educated person, you have the ability to make choices in your life and you can be a happier person. So I think sometimes we focus too much on the whole get ready for the job market. Education is also supposed to be something that brings joy to your life. And in the last few years, I think we've retreated from that. And it's one of my issues sometimes with the charter schools. I think that, especially younger children, school should be joyous. It should be something where they're learning their social skills as well and how to live in the real world. And then that will make them better and more successful employees,
Well, one of the issues-
entrepreneurs and whatever else, poets and whatever else they want to be.
One of the issues concerning charter schools, when you talk about diversity, is, because I believe this is a very serious argument, and I do not know enough to say what is, where the truth lies in this, is the idea of cherry picking students, especially the degree to which, when you have special education children who require that much more attention, and every child has a right to the full education that's going to bring them up to their full potential, pushing those kids out through whatever means. Is that a fair criticism?
In the main, it is not, but there are specific instances where that's happened. So let me take a step back. For full disclosure, I'm on the board of a charter school in Harlem that's currently operating, a founding board member of a charter school. By law, if there are more parents who want to send if there's more demand for seats than the school has seats, there has to be a lottery. So there's no specific, I'm taking you as opposed to taking you. That doesn't happen. There is a lottery process. What you're speaking to is an often used criticism, and there are some situations where this is actually the case, that a lot of charter schools don't meet what is required by law for them to have a certain number of special education, special needs students relative to what the district has. So by law, they do actually have to do that.
And also, I
compared
think
to
English
language learners.
Right.
And they must do that by law as the traditional public schools must do. What ends up happening sometimes is a lot of charters will say they want this really engaged parent. And if the parent sometimes doesn't meet certain specifications, I've heard stories, and I don't know how true some of them or most of them are, but I've heard stories where parents essentially are counseled out or away from the school because the school feels that they're not going to be as engaged as they'd like them to be. And I've been told there are instances where if the school itself just feels that they can't handle a particular child, that they counsel that family out of that school, and then what ends up happening into a traditional public school. So what you end up doing is creating situations where the traditional public schools are now so heavily saturated with these really difficult cases, whereas the charter schools then can sort of bump up their scores because they're dealing with a certain type of student. I think some of it, there are stories like that. I go back to the thing I said at the beginning, which is that there are a lot of really good schools that may not be on the radar that aren't doing this, but they're actually following the law, and they're doing really well with a lot of these students. The one other piece that I'll add is I've talked to a lot of parents about this. There are instances where some schools actually will not classify these certain children as special needs, where in other cases the traditional public school will. So what they do is, their philosophy is they try to bring the special needs child and put them in a class with general population students to have that child engage at that same level. And so there's a difference in classification. So there are a lot of nuances, but there are cases where that's true.
Go ahead.
My experience is similar to yours. There's as much variety in the charter schools as there is in the ordinary district schools. Mm-hmm. There's some charter schools that welcome special needs kids. In fact, there's one for kids with autism.
That's right.
That's all kids with autism. And there are other schools that if you tie your shoes wrong, you're out of there. And there are some...
Which is certainly a violation of the spirit of the law, if not the letter of the law.
Well, you can enforce the uniform code very strictly, and if you have your wrong color socks, you go home.
No.
So there's a big range there. What's intrinsic to the law is that there's a lottery in April. So you only get, in charter schools, you get the children whose parents know in April where they're going to live in September. And you don't get any kids mid-year. So you're not going to get homeless kids, you're not going to get kids with unstable housing, you don't get very many kids who don't speak English because their parents may not be aware of the lottery. And I don't think this is the charters trying to screen these kids out, it's just the way things.
That's right.
And then some schools accept kids in second, third, and fourth grade, but some don't.
Some don't, that's right.
So the Success Academies start out with 135 kids in kindergarten, and by 8th grade, there are only 35 left.
Right.
Whereas some of the other charter schools will take kids, but very few of them take them mid-year except from the wait list.
That's right. Remember what charters have to do. They actually have to go out and market themselves to get these kids. They have to send mailings home. They have to do flyers. You see at bus stops, you have posters to try to get parents interested in school. So a lot of the interest is word of mouth from parent to parent, and a lot of it is really through their paying attention and seeing some of the marketing tools that are out there. And to a point that you made, which is an excellent point about the tying the shoes, there is one thing that is not just inherent to charter schools, but there is a knock on them that they are more severe with this than traditional public schools, is the school to prison pipeline. This excessive suspension of young kids, predominantly Black and Latino kids, and criminalizing certain behavior at such young ages. I think some of the zero tolerance policies that some charters have, I think needs to end, because as I said, you're criminalizing certain behavior and putting kids in a system, kicking them out of school at such young ages for really minor infractions that I think leads to some really deleterious engagement of the school system down the road.
I still want to go back to your I think you have to be careful with the term cherry picking. I think there's all kinds of research on this. Charter school kids tend to have more active and engaged parents because they know enough to participate and to play the choice game, and they apply. But if you look at the demographics, charter schools in cities are still serving predominantly poor kids. Kids don't leave Stuyvesant to go to a charter school. If somebody leaves their neighborhood school to go to a charter school, which may or may not be a neighborhood school, it's usually because they're not doing well in the school they were at to begin with. And so there is some evidence, particularly in New York, not nationally, that some kids who have been challenged before are doing quite well in charter schools, and you can't ignore that kind of information. It's real. But they're not privileged kids by any means. That's why you have a disproportionate number of minority kids in charter schools.
Let me ask you though, as a policy matter, I want to ask you as well, Kathy. The charter school debate has been very much focused on the teachers union and the degree to which charters are free of many of the practices that are kind of imposed through a negotiated union contract. Because I think that schools become, are a political football. I have two kids who've gone through the public schools. Does the politicization of this debate warp how you assess
everything in education has a very high emotional quota. And when I first got the committee a number of years ago, I didn't really understand that, even though I'd been in the assembly a long time at that point and my son was younger then. It's about people's kids, it's about their children are their treasure, so people get very hot about it very quickly. I spend a lot of my week having people yell at me for something, and I sometimes I handle it better than others, but I think that the charter schools in the end only educate a fairly small amount of children, and yet they kind of suck all the air out of the room.
That's right.
Partly because there is the union element, but partly, there's obviously a kind of a robust debate about that, right? But I also think it's just, part of, I guess, the marketing of the schools. I do think that the industry, the charter school industry, would serve itself better if they didn't try to make a comparison that the regular school is bad. I think that's not a great way to go, and so that's been part of the problem. I also want to say, for myself, I voted for the creation of charter schools in '98. I think the system's big enough to have lots of different approaches. But again, we still haven't really educated a lot of high school kids. I always say, I have these people come in to see me, they want to start a charter school, and they always want a 5-year-old, Everyone loves a kindergartner, but nobody wants a smart mouth 8th grader. That's what I always say. So there aren't very many charter school, high schools, or middle schools. So and there are also some people for whom it's a racket. But there are also public schools where things aren't going right, and people have, I said, mentioned waste, fraud, and abuse, and what have you. So part of it is we have to have good oversight. We could probably always have more oversight. We have to have good oversight. And I think we have to let parents, again, going back to having more local input, I like the parent coordinative program, for example.
It's
Maybe every
excellent.
school should have that, even the charters.
Right.
I think that there are things that parents should be more well-informed, and then they could make the choices for the type of school that they want. But this, too, is going to come back to Albany, and there's issues now about a cap, a sunset, so a lot, as you said, comes back whether the council wants it or not, or even if the mayor wants it or not, it comes back to Albany, and we have to try to legislate.
It's a very polarized debate, it
really shouldn't be.
even
And it shouldn't be.
in
Sure.
academia, which should be above it. In fact, it's probably worse in academia. And it's
Well,
kind of a
academia,
gotcha.
I've always
kind of-
heard that academic politics are so intense because the stakes are so low.
Yeah, but here the stakes are very high. You
Yes,
talk
they are
about
very high.
Education. And it's kind of a gotcha game. And it seems like the charter school people are afraid they're not, are going to be rubbed out of business, and the public schools, regular public schools, are going to be eliminated. Neither is going to happen. They're both here to stay. And so what you have to do is figure out how to work with both of them. And I mean, they both have something to offer, obviously. And most people, 70% of parents still go to regular public schools. And so you can't give up on the regular public.
And just really quickly, if I may, charter schools in New York City only educate about 7% of the kids. So consider all of the conversation and debate about this issue around 7% of the kids.
But we did, okay.
Yeah, go ahead. No,
we
go.
did have a very, it was unfortunate when Bloomberg and Klein finally raised this charter school banner. They did it in such a, with such animosity with the way they implemented the schools. And they played out this, you know, a lot of charter school people think choice is about competition. I don't. I think it's about opportunity. And the idea of forcing new populations into schools that were already crowded, this whole idea did more to blemish the charter school
The entire code, the entire co-location.
co-location.
Yes.
It just was an unfortunate way to go about it. It was part and parcel of the way they did business in that administration, I think. And it was unfortunate because they created animosity in communities where they would have been received well. There's a waiting list for every
That's a
charter
very
school
good-
you have in the
I
city.
think that's a very good point.
Let me take a question. Tell us your name and tell us your campus,
good
please.
Hi, my name is Daniel Jean-Gilles. I go to John Jay. I just wanted to ask about the school to prison pipeline. I read a lot about that. And sometimes I see that there's 5-year-old that's being kicked out of school. And it seems like it's a lack of leadership to me on the side of the teachers. Because if you actually kicking a 5-year-old out of class, that means that you are failing too. Why is it that we're not building our teachers to lead the students? Because at 5-year-old, somebody can lead a 5-year-old. Why is it that we're not teaching the teachers to lead instead of just testing them? Because the student needs structures too. Because without structure, you can't learn if there's no structure.
No, that's a great question and point. My mother taught public school. She taught special ed in Queens for almost 30 years. And I went to Catholic school at a time when you got paddled and you could be thrown against the locker if you got out of hand. Can't do that anymore, apparently. But, I think that one of the things that is endemic to communities of color, and I respect teachers greatly, and what's unfortunate is that in the charter debate, the teachers do get a bad rap because there is that blame game. But what is true is that in communities of color, a lot of the teachers actually just don't stay very long. There's a lot of very high teacher turnover in schools and communities of color. And I think sometimes, and folks have been saying this particularly in Harlem for decades, that it goes back to the community control question, that if you have teachers from the community that understand the community, that are raised in the community or live there and are willing to really stay there and invest in these children, not that most teachers don't, but that if you emphasize that more, you may have teachers and administrators that will engage the kids and the parents in ways that don't create a situation where they're just instantly being kicked out and suspended.
I do want to say, though, and to that question, that, and I agree, with what you're saying, but I also want to point out we need legislation. That's what we do. We've been working with Judge Kaye for quite a while to kind of calibrate something. We're going to introduce a bill this year that's going to set standards. I had a school in my district that handcuffed a 5-year-old a number of years ago. It's absolutely unacceptable every single time. It's never acceptable. There had to be another way to handle that incident. And so we have to come up with legislation. We do have to do what you say. Encourage teachers to stay, discourage teacher burnout, give people the adequate funding. I mean, it's a whole package of things. But in the end, there's never an excuse for handcuffing a 5-year-old.
That's right.
So no matter how bad the situation is, there has to be another way to handle it. And I can tell you that in the school where it happened, there was a turnover in principal. There was a brand new principal. There was a brand new AP. It was an extremely overcrowded school. The youngster had some emotional issues, and I think people reacted in anger, just like you might with your own child.
Let me try to get some more questions in.
Hello, my name is Karlsky Belazer. I'm at Queens College. How do we get equal access to public education if there's so much residential segregation in the city? Should we do away with school zones?
I want to answer that
Yes.
one. Yeah, no, I'm very interested in this question. At the new school, we are launching a study to see if, in fact, there's as much segregation in housing as is commonly believed. We know that the schools are highly segregated. We know they're among the most segregated in the country. However, we also know that there's been the return of the middle class to urban neighborhoods. Anytime you walk through Harlem or Crown Heights or Fort Greene or Washington Heights, you can see that there's an economic mix which wasn't there before. When I talk about integration, I think economic integration is what counts. We know that one of the reasons that poor white children tend to do better than poor black children is that poor white children tend to be in schools with other poor white children tend to be in schools with middle-class white children, and poor black children tend to be in schools with other poor black children. So if you care, and that a very inexpensive, effective way to improve educational outcomes for poor kids is to mix them up with middle-class kids. I think that we have a historic opportunity for the first time in 50 years to have integrated zoned neighborhood schools because of the demographic changes. But I have to do the studies too. Appleseed did a study that estimated that about half the school districts could be integrated.
Depending on how you draw the lines of the districts, or?
Well, I mean, I have to study that more carefully. There are some in District 13 in Brooklyn, which is Fort Greene, downtown Brooklyn, the Clinton Hill. Only 42% of the children attend their neighborhood schools, which means that there's high dissatisfaction with the local schools, and parents will do anything they can to get them out of there. So the neighborhood is quite prosperous. The neighborhood is quite prosperous, but the schools are not. So we have the schools are more segregated than the neighborhoods.
Very interesting. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Swatantha Paulson. I'm a student at York College, and my question is, how do we hold the powerful governor that we have accountable for adequate funding to New York City schools when his primary focus is upstate New York and Long Island and suburban New York State? And what happened to the campaign for fiscal equality movement?
Well, I just want to say that's why we have a legislature, right? We don't have only a governor or only a mayor. We have a legislative body. Then we help check that and I don't know that I would agree with that premise, but I think the governor does care about I hope he cares about all parts of the state. I certainly believe that he does. But we exist as local representatives to advocate for our local areas, and that's how we try to solve that problem. Perhaps imperfectly, but that's how we
I do think
try.
the governor has a reason to focus on upstate because
Yeah,
the economic problems are that much more
Well, he wouldn't
intense.
say that. He
Right.
wouldn't say he's
Part of
focusing on upstate.
Part of the problem is the mechanism. In order to make spending more equal, what the legislature does is it puts more money into poor districts. But what makes some districts capable of spending a lot more is their local
Tax base.
So the total amount of what's spent on a child includes local spending, state spending, and federal spending. And so if you're looking at Scarsdale or Greenwich, Connecticut, the people there are able to tax themselves more, and there's only so much that the state legislature can make up the difference. So you people put more money in, but it doesn't quite make it up.
$22 billion is still a lot of money.
It is a lot
Let
of
me
money.
try to get a few more questions in, please.
Hello, my name is Raymond Ranaletta. I'm a graduate student at Brooklyn College. In the discussion, I've heard a lot of need to have a national standard in Common Core. Would it be perhaps better, being that there's 50 states that are uniquely different from one another, to have each state have a state standard to which all the students should try to achieve, rather than having a national government, a federal
Well, at one
government?
point, of course, the problem is that at one point those state standards meant separate and supposedly
They were very
separate
uneven.
and unequal systems. I mean, one of those arguments is that the investment, there's also a race to the bottom economically. There's not only a race to the top educationally, there's a race to the bottom economically, and that will be reflected in schools. But
Right, and remember, there are 50 states, but there are over 10,000 school districts in this country. And so you have over 10,000 ways of looking at how to teach 2 times 2 is 4. It is 4, right? Yeah, 2 times 2 is 4. And so
I'm a print guy.
right.
I'm not a technical.
And so there are over 10,000 ways of looking at that and teaching that. And so even when you go to a state model, even within that state, you're going to have tremendous diversity.
Yes, sir.
My name is Mohammad Shafiqul Alam. I am from Queen's College, and I am the transfer student. I came from Bangladesh. When I admit in the college, then I got TAB, but I did not get the FAFSA because this is my second bachelor. So my question is, does Party Caucus of Congress discuss with the State Assembly for any policy in the lawmaking process in Congress?
Well, if you're asking about TAP, I just want to, I don't know how much you would be eligible or any individual person is eligible for. We have tried to increase the amount of money that we give. I don't think we do graduate TAP to the extent that perhaps you would like, but it's something that we certainly, it's about choices. And right now, a lot of the emphasis in education funding is on, though we spend a lot on higher ed, a lot of the emphasis is on K through 12. I don't know if that fully answered the question, but.
Yes, sir.
Yes, my name is Jared Winston. I go to John Jay College. I'm curious to know about the curriculum in elementary schools. My girlfriend's daughter was in first grade in Staten Island, transferred to Brooklyn first grade because of a move. And when she went, she was far behind from the school that she went to in Staten Island. And she had to go quickly into a reading A to D. Who do you feel turned a blind eye in not really paying attention to how each public school does their curriculum?
Well, this is
very
one of
good
the
question,
arguments
very
for the
interesting
Common Core.
Well, no, but this is a very interesting question. I mean, here you have standards across the city system, but yet they're taught very differently, school by school. I mean, schools are run by people. My own personal view and my own experience with the school system is the degree to which a principal is the most important person in, as the leader of a school, who will put together a cadre of teachers and, who learns how to work the bureaucracy, just the way parents have to learn how to work the bureaucracy to get their kids
Schools
into
get
good schools.
defensive, though. I would say I know there are a number of books that my son read, like in 7th grade, and then he read in the elementary school in 5th grade, excerpts, and then he read again in middle school, and there's still some of them are retreading out in 9th grade. So there's not a lot of, Nancy Zimfer, the executive for our SUNY system, keeps talking about silos, which is she comes from the Midwest, it's a farm word. But we do have in education a tendency for people to be in these little boxes, I'll say the urban way, and there's not enough coordination, with the various schools. And so you do get that kind of unfortunate and really wrong kind of thing where maybe a school is doing something different and a child moves and they're really behind the 8 ball. So I think that, I'm actually very optimistic that Carmen Freeman, because she was an educator and is an educator, I always say she's forgotten more than most people know, is really going to work to address that. I think that was one of the many criticisms of Joel Klein, who stayed way too long as chancellor and did not have an educational background. So I think some of that was allowed to sort of drift off.
Well, it was kind of a
and I think it'll
management
be
orientation.
Yes,
It was kind of,
and I'm hoping that she will have more of a focus on what's happening in the
is
classroom.
the interest of hedge
so
fund
that type of
operators in
thing,
the
I don't
charter
know where the
schools.
gentleman went, but that type of thing doesn't happen as often as we hear about it.
One of the really interesting, and this goes to something you talked about earlier in terms of diversity, class diversity within schools. One of the things that struck me when you asked the question was that a lot of the school choice conversations are about charters and, to a lesser extent, vouchers, because in New York that's kind of a non-starter. But one of the things that I've heard a lot about recently is not school vouchers, but housing vouchers, so that you can take that voucher and not necessarily change schools, but change where you live, so that you can actually move more freely into a district that actually educates your child in a way that you see more appropriate. So I'll just say that because it just struck me when you had that question. Yeah.
No, I feel bad about the little kid that went from Staten Island to Brooklyn, and I think that with 12 years under Bloomberg, one of the things he did is he broke up a really ossified bureaucracy.
I agree with that.
Which was a dinosaur which had been going nowhere for a long time.
Yeah.
and he gave principals much more autonomy to hire their own teachers, set their own course, and I think that was a very good thing. Unfortunately, what that meant was a principal who didn't know what she was doing would be set adrift and not get any direction. And so the school like Staten Island may have been
The other
a
problem,
principal who had too much autonomy.
I mean, because we're almost going to run out of time, but my brother worked at, at 65 Court Street, not really 110 Livingston, but was in the central administration. And what the Bloomberg people did in this move to break up the ossified bureaucracy is they also took out the institutional memory of the school system. And what my brother always said to me is that if everything runs well, it's better not to have those people there. But if something goes wrong, and in a system of 1.1 million children
It goes wrong every minute.
and 130,000 employees, things are going to go wrong. There was nobody to manage their way through
I would
the
just
crisis.
say this, I have said this before, but not on a television show, but I've said that if Mayor Bloomberg had hired a business person like Joe Klein for 2 years to break up and make changes, I think he would have gone down, and then replaced him with someone like Carmen Frenier, I think he would have gone down as a much better mayor and a much better education mayor. As a matter of fact, as we all know, Joel, those on the panel know that Joel had a different deputy chancellor, first deputy chancellor, every single year that he served. So there was always this turmoil happening underneath. And I think in the end, children, it's about children. People shy away from turmoil and controversy when it's about their precious child. So I think my own feeling is it would have been great for a year or two, but it stretched on way too long, and in its own way became ossified too, because you had this sort of allegiance to certain things, whether it was sort of a blind faith in co-location or whether it was closing high schools that had its own problems. And the system is very organic and has to always be reflecting of what the problems are in front of you, not the problems that used to be. So that's how I come down on it. I'm actually very hopeful that Frenier will bring a certain amount of not just healing, but a certain amount of uniformity and moving forward. And I'm certainly trying to give it all the support I can to do that.
I'll just add very quickly to your point about the ossification. I think in also that breakup, what a recent news story, which sort of got lost in all of this, was that the small schools that he created are actually educating kids much better than they had been before.
I always make that line. I got the goodbye sign. I want to thank everybody for joining us, and we'll see you next time on CUNY Forum. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you very much.
This is very spirited.